Today's topic is something very, very sensitive. It is something that unfortunately Chris and I, with Been There Got Out, see more often than we'd like, and that's why we wanted to talk about it today. Okay, great, Brian, I see you. Um, so with extremely difficult cases, we often get situations where there has been a child reporting inappropriate touching and wants to know how to handle what to do. So I thought it'd be super helpful to have an attorney who has experience in this area come on and talk to you to make sure that you don't kind of mess up your case from the beginning. Of course, it's really, really scary when your child reports that, unfortunately, and most frighteningly, that their other parent might have been touching them in ways they shouldn't. And I'm going to be really careful with my language just to be certain that that I don't get censored. But Brian, I'm just checking to see that you're okay with the volume. So I was just saying that our community is dealing with all these like situations, unfortunately, which are not common in the rest of society, but because Chris and I only deal with difficult, extreme cases of separations, divorces, custody battles, and co-parenting hell, that the topic of one parent reporting that the other parent has been inappropriately touching the child comes up often, and more unfortunately, we see where frequently the parent who has the child reporting to them freaks out, which is a normal feeling, but then they do things which might mess up the case, and then they feel like they're not able to protect their child. So before we even get into like who you are, so I know, we'll introduce you as an attorney and all that,
Sure.
But how common do you see situations where during a divorce or during litigation that one parent reports that the other parent is inappropriately touching a child?
Yeah, I think that topic comes up quite a bit. I don't specialize in divorce law, but in the cases that I handle, and I certainly get familiar and involved in matters involving spouses in which that accusation is laid. I think for the most time, there's probably some truth to every one of those allegations in my experience. It doesn't necessarily, there might be some wiggle room in terms of where it actually lies, but I think it's pretty common, unfortunately, in an abusive relationship to have the kids suffer to some extent.
Wow. Okay, so Brian, can you introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background as it relates to this particular issue?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a trial attorney. I'm the managing partner of a law firm called Greenberg Gross, which is based in California, Nevada, and New York. We handle a lot of different things, but one of my personal specialties is handling cases involving childhood sexual assault in the context of civil lawsuits. Typically, that means that when a child is sexually abused, I'm suing a church, a school, a daycare, a sports facility, something like that, some environment in which a pedophile is allowed access to kids and sexually abuses them. I do get cases at times involving what I call familial abuse, where there are issues of no institution involved, just some individual who sexually assaults another. But that's primary. I only do civil work, but sexual abuse is one of the most popular or my most common areas that I get involved in.
Wow. Okay. So how do these cases generally begin? Like, how do you know, like, how do they start?
Well, it starts with someone reaching out to our firm, right? We have a reputation. We do some, consumer awareness out there that we're a firm that specializes in this, because it's not a big legal community that actually handles these cases.
Mm-hmm.
But it starts with either a phone call or sometimes it's an email. A lot of times survivors of abuse or parents of survivors are a little reluctant to call a stranger on the phone. So they might submit, a web form or a chat or something like that and give us basic information. And if it's something that we cover, we have a meeting and we decide whether we can help. And at that point, once we retain a case, we move forward in terms of gathering information, corroborating what the allegations are, making sure that it happened and that we can prove it. A lot of times there are situations where we believe that an incident happened, but we don't necessarily think we can prove it in a court of law. It's a different thing than of believing something to be true versus being able to prove it to a burden of proof. But in the cases that we do, we do what the client wants, whether that's trying to resolve it without a lawsuit or filing a lawsuit and going to trial. Everyone's path towards healing is different.
Hmm.
And we try to, choose the best path that fits the goals of our individual
Yeah.
clients.
So let's say, and I can say this because my kids are young adults now, but
Sure.
let's say my daughter was really little and she came back from a visit with her father and she told me that he was inappropriately touching her. Like, what's the first thing that I should do to make sure that she's as safe as possible and that I handle this legally, properly moving forward?
Well, I think the first thing that a parent should do in that situation is set aside the legal part of it and just be there for your child. Children that are sexually abused or even physically abused and so emotionally abused, what they want to have happen more than anything is to be believed. One
Hmm.
of the reasons that kids delay, months, years, decades at times, and relaying the fact that they were sexually abused is the fear of not being believed and the fear of being blamed. So the
Hmm.
first thing, in my opinion, in my experience, based on what I do, the first thing any parent should do with the child who comes forward is emphasize that you believe them, that you're there for them, that you love them, and that it's not their fault. After you enforce that so it helps them feel powerful and comfortable discussing it, that's when you start dealing with ramifications about, do you contact law enforcement? Do you contact a state agency like Child Protective Services? There's a lot of different steps you could take, but the first thing is to comfort that child, tell them you're there for them, and seek appropriate medical attention, of course.
Okay, so medical attention is important because we see people often, they'll just call CPS directly without going to the doctor. Why is it important to first seek medical attention?
Well, I think, again, two things. The non-legal side of it is to make sure the child's okay. That
Right.
there are injuries that occur in these type of events, and you want to seek the appropriate medical attention to resolve any of those injuries. I think the other thing is to document any physical evidence that remains to prove that the abuse actually happened.
Hmm.
There's a term commonly referred to as the rape kit test. Those happen, those get administered depending on, or can be administered depending on how quickly after the incident something is reported. But just frankly, on the legal side of it too, just the fact that someone goes to the doctor and reports it and initiates that kind of action is corroboration of the fact that it occurred.
Hmm.
Because a child isn't going to go, or a parent's not going to take a child to a medical facility and go through that process unless it actually happened and they believe that it happened. So it's an important step for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so in our cases, most of the time, the people are sharing custody. And so they're following a court order that says that this person has visitation, and then a child comes back, reports these things, and then there's this dilemma of what do
Yeah,
I do? Like,
right.
what do you suggest someone does? Because there is a court order, and then how do you determine when it's okay to say, no, you're not going over there, or like, I still have to follow the order? That's really hard.
That's a very good point. I'm going to assume that in some of those situations where there's, joint custody and perhaps,
Mhm.
after divorce, there might be family law counsel involved to a certain extent. I
Yeah.
think, contacting or re-engaging your family law attorney who helped create that custody arrangements is a good step. I think if there's no doubt that this is a serious situation that needs to be reported, I think reporting it to law enforcement is a really good idea. I mean, law enforcement is there for a reason. Law enforcement, most agencies, depending on the state, but most sophisticated police departments have special departments that deal with these types of allegations, meaning officers and caseworkers who are trained to properly address allegations of childhood sexual abuse, as opposed to, the cop that's out there doing the normal day-to-day things. I'm not disparaging those
Mhm.
officers, but it's a specialized skill and talent. And so if you contact law enforcement, they should be able to put you in the right hands to deal with it. And I would think that that would immediately resolve any custody issue too. Obviously, if the police officer feels there's something there and he or she needs to do something about it, I think custody rights in terms of visitation on the weekends or whatnot becomes secondary to the criminal investigation. I'd also assume Child Protective Services would be a good source with that. Again, that department might vary by name per state.
Mhm.
In California, that's what the department's called, but I'm sure that it's not uncommon for them to have to get involved in the legality of custody arrangements when these types of accusations are are made. But I think as a practical matter, what you're going to do is do whatever's safe for the child, right? And deal with the ramifications of the custody agreement later.
Yeah. Yeah. So, because, we only deal with high conflict, a lot of times we see these allegations weaponized against innocent
Correct.
people. How common is that? There's an attorney that I interviewed in the past who used to work for CPS, and she said it really escalates during a difficult divorce or separation where she actually said that she feels like now is one of the least safe times for men, and we have a number of male clients who feel like this has been just thrown out there and it's keeping them away from their kids where there's no basis. Like, tell us about your experience with that.
Yeah, that's really tragic to hear, and I wish it didn't occur. Obviously, it does. Again, I don't do divorce law specifically, but I can tell you that, in that context, I think the child is crucial to that. As a parent, I think when your client, I'm sorry, not your client, when your child is being truthful and forthcoming with you, and I would hope that either the parent being accused or the parent that is supporting the child making that accusation would be able to test sort of the credibility or the veracity of those comments. But that's a difficult issue. It's tragic to hear because that only puts the child in the middle and is only going to harm that child. I would, my advice to anybody facing that circumstances is to immediately consult with the appropriate, divorce or family law attorney who could better gauge that. And the line of work that I do, which is, and again, most of the time, kids who are abused in the context of some institutional setting, I generally believe that 99.9% of the time that child is telling the truth. The last thing that a child wants to do is report that they've been sexually abused. Again, because they have these fears of being blamed or not believed, or just being scared of speaking out against some authority figure like a teacher or a coach or a religious figure. So in the civil context, it's very, very, very rare to have an accusation of childhood sexual assault that's not actually true or something that can be corroborated. But in the family law dispute, I could see how the parent takes over because of because of the divorce battle, and things turn ugly, and obviously don't have the best interests of the child in mind.
Yeah. So I'm thinking also about like this is awful, but and the whole thing is, but like really little kids that can't speak. I mean, I remember interviewing a detective who worked for Child Protective Services, and he said something like it's a little bit tricky when you have kids that are younger than 6 years old because they're not swearable. And so there's this dispute about like how do you know if a kid is telling, like a really little kid, not like a little bit older. How do
Yeah.
you deal with something like that?
No, it's again another tragedy. And what I do is I see cases again in the civil context where kindergartners or preschool age children are in fact sexually abused in some daycare or school setting. It's much harder to prove from my perspective, but there are certainly steps you can take. Children who go through that type of trauma, they may not be able to articulate it, but they're gonna show signs that are consistent with it, such as, bedwetting is a common example, a completely different change in behavior, how that child reacts around the alleged accuser. If that child used to be very, very close to that person, then all of a sudden cries and runs into the other room when he or she comes to the house, that's a good sign. If it happens in a school setting like I see, you could have a kid that, every other day loved to go to school and always came home talking about her teacher or his, supervisor or whatever on the playground in a positive way, and then all of a sudden doesn't want to go to school the next day, refuses, doesn't articulate exactly why, but exhibits some type of behavior that, again, a parent should be able to recognize and say, that's not normal. I should look into this further. There are also forensic psychologists that specialize in navigating young children through this type of circumstance. And you can get further and can perhaps are better suited to get more information than simply a parent talking to the child about it. Depends on the situation, depends on the child, of course, a variety of factors. But more than anything, I would look for changes of behavior that just don't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's really helpful because I'm thinking, it's not just a report. There's all kinds of other things like nonverbal signs that something is really, really wrong.
Correct.
I'm wondering also, do you think that certain kids are more susceptible or certain people are more susceptible to being abuse victims versus others?
I don't, well, I think that yes is the answer to
Right. I'm not
that.
saying
I think
to
that,
blame them, but I
sure.
but I have an interesting, I'll wait to hear what you say
Yeah.
first.
So what I see in very, very, often in the context, particularly of cases against religious institutions and schools, is that
Mhm.
the pedophile or the priest, the teacher, the youth minister, whoever it might be, becomes aware of some vulnerability that that child has. Maybe that child's part of a broken home. Maybe that child, lost a sibling or lost a parent, something that makes them vulnerable. And what pedophiles do tragically is they exploit those vulnerabilities to try to fill in that void that is left by, some tragedy in that child's life otherwise. So it's very, very common for me to see cases in which someone is abused in an institutional setting where the pedophile takes advantage of and manipulates that vulnerability. So I guess that makes them more susceptible, not because they did anything wrong, but
Right, right.
simply because of the family dynamic or the personal tragedy or series of tragedies that put them in that state of mind where all they're looking for is the attention and love and guidance of an authority figure like a priest, like a youth counselor, like a teacher, things like that.
Yeah. So I read this book. It's called Conversations with a Pedophile years
Mm,
ago. The author happened to be local and we talked about it. But she said the book is actually about her interviewing a pedophile who did, affected like many, many boys over a long time. And he was in jail. She was a psychologist. And as she interviewed him, he told her basically how he groomed, how he managed to continue the manipulation. And he said that what he would do was when he'd first be alone with a child, he would do something that he knew the child wasn't allowed to do. So he'd give them something, like let's say they weren't supposed to have candy, be like, I'm going to give this candy to you, but it's our secret. Like, don't tell your parents. And if the kid ended up telling the parents, like, let's say next time the parents gave him without even saying like a weird look, he
sure.
would back off
Yeah.
because he knew that the kid was the type of person that would confide in their parents. And then if nothing happened, he would take it a step further where he'd be like, we're going to, smoke something together. I know we're not supposed to. And then he'd make the child feel like they were at fault as well. And that if they told, that they would get in trouble too. So it wouldn't just be him. It was like they did it together. And so that's what kept a lot of people silent because they thought that they would get in trouble if they reported what was going on. They felt like they were just as wrong as the person doing it to them, especially because of an adult or an authority figure.
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking. I mean, I see it every day, unfortunately. But pedophiles become master manipulators and
Right.
they get away with what they do for a long period of time because they're very good at it.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the times it's not, a child isn't abused by force, meaning they're held down and there's some physical assault. It's not that. It's a very elaborate, orchestrated grooming process that starts with the things like you say. And they also groom the child towards touch. So they might start by repeatedly, putting their arm on their shoulder, and then maybe that turns
Mm-hmm.
into, a hug, and maybe that turns into a kiss on the palm. They go slow, right? And they try to manipulate the child into believing that that touch is normal. So then when it escalates, it's just a kind of a continuation of that touching process.
Wow.
And fear and intimidation is a big one. I mean, I've had cases where a religious figure said, "Look, spiritually, this is what God or whatever spiritual being they believe in wants," and they literally
Mm-hmm.
like almost guilt them into that process.
Yeah.
You know, teachers that do this kind of thing threaten things like grades. I see teachers that threaten immigration issues. Perhaps the child comes from a family that has some immigration issue, and it says, "Hey, if you ever talk about this, your family's going to be deported, or you're going to get kicked out of school, or any number of things." It's tragic. So I'm a parent too, and the things that and I have kids. I have 4 kids actually, and growing up with a dad who does this kind of law, puts them at some advantages or disadvantages. Like I'm pretty strict and protective over them, but
Yeah.
I always ask questions like, hey, who do you hang out? Do you when they came home and they say, hey, I hung out with this teacher at lunch, that's a huge red flag for me. It's like, why did you do that? Were you with other people? Was this something you do every day?
Mm-hmm.
Was this your idea? Did the teacher ask you to do it? But look for, a lot of times that child won't come home and tell the parent exactly what is happening, but they might give you clues
Hmm.
that parents look out for. Something that's just not a typical, normal relationship, for lack of a better word, between an authority figure and your child.
Wow. Okay, so I know, you don't usually do the familial part of it,
Right.
but are there any things, so we talked about regression, like bedwetting. Are there other things that we should look for with children or teens and tweens, which might signify that something is really wrong, whether it's that or something else that's significant?
Other than what we've already discussed, again, I have to use the word tragic. I see self
Yeah.
harm quite a bit. Cutting,
Self-harm.
it's behavior that is essentially a cry for help by that child. They're just
Hmm.
not verbalizing what's happening. um, it just changes of appearance, just drastic, like, your child from point A to point B turns into somebody completely different.
Hmm.
There's some cause behind that. It doesn't, whether it's, the other parent in the relationship, again, a teacher or someone else at school in their life, a bad boyfriend, bullying at school, they may not be verbalizing what's happening, but they're changing their behavior in a significant way that should cause you pause and reason to sit down with them directly or get a professional involved in doing so.
Yeah. Okay, I just thought of something. So I imagine
Sure.
because you work with families or, involved in these situations, whoever the perpetrator is, that you're dealing with parents who feel a tremendous amount of guilt or a sense
Absolutely.
of helplessness. What do you have any advice for parents who this has either happened to their child or they suspect that it's happening? Like, how can you deal with this sense of like, I either haven't protected my child or I should have done more, or what can I do now? Like this like sense of failure.
Yeah, no, it's actually one of the hardest things I have to do is, as lawyers, we're also counselors at law, right? And you turn into a counselor in many ways. I try my best, and it's often more likely than not going to be unsuccessful to reinforce with that parent. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. But as a parent, of course, you're going to blame yourself in that circumstance. What in that situation, what I generally try to do is refocus that parent, meaning take them from a place of regret and self blame to, okay, now you have power, this is happening. So let's take
Hmm.
charge and advocate on behalf of your child and become the person that helps that child or guides them through the typically long recovery process from childhood sexual abuse, because that child wants help, that child wants support. And if that child sees that their mom or their dad has their back every step of the way, is
Hmm.
fighting the institution or the perpetrator that caused this, is working with the police to hold that perpetrator accountable, is getting them the medical care and attention that they need, all of that, then that, focus your efforts not on blaming you for not blaming yourself for not noticing it, but on that child's recovery.
Yeah. Oh, that's so helpful. Um, what was I going to say? Oh, okay. I'm always like jotting things down as you're talking because I didn't want to interrupt. But
Yeah.
I think that the sense also is my child going to be ruined forever after something like this?
Look, I think the answer to that is, indisputably no, but intervention is
Mhm.
necessary. I think if you leave it alone and you hide it and you don't get the proper care and attention that that child needs, then yeah, then they typically, as I describe it, I have a lot of clients who come forward decades later, right,
Mhm.
about being abused in an institutional setting, and they describe in different ways, but the common setting of they stick it in a box, they put it in the back of their brain, and they never want to open up that box again. But unbeknownst to them, when you're a survivor, that box gets opened all the time and you may not
Mhm.
realize it. So, it can lead to lifelong problems involving trust and self blame and just this overall lack of self confidence. So, the answer doesn't have to be that that's your future and that it's going to, affect you for the rest of your life. It's
Mhm.
you need to take appropriate response. There's specific mental health experts that focus on helping trauma survivors, particularly survivors of childhood sexual assault, work through that, regain their power, and retarget their focus mentally so that they can hopefully live a very long, helpful, happy, productive life.
Yeah. What about, is there anything in particular if someone is thinking, okay, I need to get my child help or my teenager help, like something in a professional that they should look for in terms of certifications or even just human qualities?
Yeah, Sure. So, again, because the United States is big, of course, and there's lots of different doctors and specialists in every community. Google's a great source. If you Google, trauma therapy for kids,
Mhm.
you will find people that specialize in that. And obviously as a parent, if a child going through this, you're going to want to vet those individuals extensively. Meaning, do they just have a web page that say they do this, but they don't really? Versus, in speaking with them and vetting them, you find out, look, on a day-to-day basis, this is what this particular mental health expert focuses on. I think if you're involved in a criminal case, for example, there's usually a victim advocate
Mhm.
that's also involved in the criminal process. And those victim advocates are great at connecting survivors or parents of survivors to appropriate resources, again, that specialize in this particular area and the particular need.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this has been so helpful, and I really appreciate your coming on to talk about it. I'm like jotting all these
Sure.
little notes that I want to put in the summary, but how can people find you?
Sure. So, easiest way probably is to go to our website. We have two of them. My law firm is called Greenberg Gross. We have a website called ggtriallaw.com. More specific to sexual abuse, we have a separate site. It's called Fight for Survivors. That's still part of Greenberg Gross. And what that site does is provide a lot of educational materials out there. Some of the things like we've been talking, what to look for,
Mhm.
what to do and not to do. We regularly post on these topics on our social media pages. So, either GG Trial Law or fightforsurvivors.com would be the good first step.
All right, great. Well, thank you again, Brian, so much for coming on and talking about this.
Of course, sorry for the tech problem
That's
there in the
okay.
beginning, but I'm glad we worked through it.
Me too.
All right.
All right, let's stay in touch for sure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, bye.